thank you, Dawn. So yes, unsurprisingly, I guess all those who are participating in these workshops are still on their first steps or about to take them. So not surprising that you wouldn't have started measuring, which is the majority of you. But also good to see that about 2/3 are actually already measuring or doing something. So that's good. Have you not, if you haven't measured your emissions, what have prevented you from doing so? So interesting. Yes, not surprisingly, internal resource. And don't know how to do it. So yes, we hope that this workshop will help you to direct you to where to go. And finally, if you have measured them, what are you doing with them? So some not applicable. So some of you are reporting already and you have obligations, and a number of you don't know what to do. So we hope that this workshop will give you the answers.
I think, judging by those poll results, Brigitte, I think there's a lot of people hopefully in the right place for today. And I think the objective of these workshops, which is what we set out last month in the first episode, is to try and make UK's members the tools, all the expertise and the knowledge to be able to understand how to go about their net zero journey, either to do it themselves or potentially to understand that they're looking for some help from someone like ENCM to navigate the net zero waters. So I think that's probably a good place to jump on in terms of what we covered last month. And I'll be as brief as I can. I'm just going to use one slide because it kind of forms the basis of how we're approaching the kind of these seminars, I suppose, these workshops. So in essence, that everybody knows, thanks Emma, everybody knows that what we're trying to do here is we're trying to get to net zero by 2050, possibly sooner, depending on this particular trade association you're connected to, potentially. And that actually, in order to do that, first and foremost, we need to set some kind of a baseline for where we are today and where we're hoping to go to tomorrow. In order to do that, you need to collect data. We're going to talk about the data itself today. That's the purpose of today's session. But in essence, what we talked about last week was actually that you approach the target in phase. You set a baseline, or you create a baseline and set a target, whatever that target is that's relevant for your business. Firstly, you look for efficiency wins, low cost, no cost options, things you can put in place to really help your business. And then you shout about them. You try and disclose to the world what it is that you've been doing. Now, mandatory schemes that exist, things like SECA and ESOS, encourage you to do that already. Once you've done that, you then look for kind of making investment decisions. This is kind of the medium to high cost options. So actually this is process improvement, kit replacement, things like compressors, boilers, all the bigger ticket items that have a more significant impact on your overall energy use and therefore your carbon impact. When you've done that and you've optimized how much energy you're using on site, then you consider looking at things like on-site generation. Although a lot of you will have already potentially looked at solar because of the natural advantages that the roof spaces that a lot of you have will provide. So I know that solar is something a lot of people have looked at, but making sure that those on-site generation capabilities are appropriate and proportionate to the actual energy use you have, not just the energy that you waste. And then when you've done all of that is to look at how you might offset or take green energy contracts to look at the residual kind of carbon impact you have as an organisation. And then that is how you will ultimately get to net zero. But what we talked about last time, and we'll reiterate throughout these through these workshops, is that the journey to net zero isn't a linear one. And actually, many businesses will take different routes to get to the end goal. And there are lots of different ways to go about that. But what we're trying to show here is that there is the simple basics of getting to net zero don't have to be complicated and also don't have to be intimidating. And what Emma is going to talk to you about today is this grey line at the bottom, which is data collection. Now, the full version of this slide says data collection of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And what we're going to talk today about is those emissions, scopes 1 and 2 primarily, and how you can start to understand what they are and how to start recording them.
Well, thanks, Adam. So to start with, in terms of your carbon footprinting, as Adam said, it really hinges on the data collection. But realistically, what is that data that you need to cover and collect in order to build your carbon footprint? So to start with, we'll look at the definitions of greenhouse gases and the definition of emissions and what they are in plain language. So the Oxford English Dictionary, I feel like I'm going into a wedding speech now, defines greenhouse gases as a gas that contributes to the greenhouse effect by absorbing infrared radiation. And greenhouse gases are made up primarily of the 6 examples that you'll see listed here. Some which are more familiar, such as the CO2 or carbon dioxide, and others that I'm not even going to try to pronounce, slightly less familiar. Emissions then are exactly that, and greenhouse gases which are emitted into the atmosphere and thus absorb the infrared radiation of the planet. So what makes up a business's greenhouse gas emissions? So as this diagram shows, there are 3 groupings of greenhouse gas emissions, and these are known as scopes. So you've got scope 1, 2, and 3, as Adam said earlier. These encompass the greenhouse gases that are produced by the 3 areas of business operations. You're talking the upstream activities, the core direct company activity, but also the downstream activities of the business as well. So you're talking supply chain in both the upstream and the downstream activities. So to get into a bit more detail then, scope 1, 2, and 3. As I said, greenhouse gas emissions are categorized into 3 groups by the most widely used accounting tool for carbon reporting, and that's the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Scope 1 covers the direct emissions from owned or controlled sources. So that's things like your company car fleet, your own boilers. Scope 2 covers indirect emissions from the generation of purchased electricity, steam, heating, and cooling. So very much sources which you purchase and the utilities which you purchase. Scope 3 then includes all other indirect emissions that occur within your value chain or your upstream and downstream activities. As Adam said, scope 1 and 2 is what we're focusing on today, with scope 3 still to come in, I think it's workshop 4 of this programme. There's been a whole session dedicated to scope 3, mainly because it packs in a lot of activities. There are 15 main categories, as you can see, and numerous subcategories within those, and it can get really complicated very quickly. So it's worth taking the time in session 4 to really go into how complex it can be and how it can be made easier if you choose to go into scope 3. So starting off, scope 1. And I suppose the first question really to answer about scope 1 is, where do the emissions come from? So scope 1 emissions, as we said, are known as the direct emissions, and so usually should be pretty straightforward. So emissions come from the use of a fuel, or in the case of fugitive gases, refrigerants, in an asset that you as a business have control over. So this means the natural gas that is put into your boilers, the petrol that goes into your company cars, diesel into your lorries, LPG into your forklifts, refrigerant into your chillers, the list goes on. But what is it that you should and you shouldn't worry about? Realistically, provided you've got some aspect of record keeping for what you as a business purchase in terms of fuel or refrigerants, there's nothing that you need to worry about, apart from making sure that that data is extractable from your systems, be it a spreadsheet or an accounting software, when you need it. Next, how do you measure your Scope 1 emissions? As Adam said before, reporting on your carbon footprint is key when you've got the data. So measuring your Scope 1 emissions really hinges on measuring the fuel sources and what you're putting into your business. So for natural gas, this could be your utility invoices. For petrol, downloads of accounts from your fuel card provider or your fuel delivery agent invoices in terms of LPG, or your regassing service records for things like your refrigerants if you're going into the fugitive gases element of the reporting. How do you manage your Scope 1 emissions? With Scope 1, everything that you do to your plant is how you manage your emissions. Are you sure that everything that you have is operating as efficiently as possible? Is your condensing boiler set to the correct temperature scales, for example? Are your drivers of company vehicles sat idling while they're waiting to pick somebody up, or waiting to go into a meeting? If they've arrived a bit earlier, they sat there with the engine on and the radio on. How can you manage that? And a lot of that is just how your business works and how you operate in terms of policies, and ensuring that people understand the environmental and emission impacts of their activities and their behaviour. But how do you understand the data? So, as Adam said, the data is key to knowing your carbon footprint, and particularly for Scope 1, where the data that you're collecting is exactly what you're going to be reporting on. So what you get from different sources of your Scope 1 emissions will vary. Will it be cost for fuel purchases from your fuel card provider? Will it be litres of fuel? Depending on what you get from your suppliers will determine how accurate your carbon footprint is. So looking at your carbon footprint for Scope 1 as a whole, if you only have cost data, your emissions footprint is likely to be less accurate. It's likely to be less accurate than if you had litre data, for example, for everything that you put into your company vehicles, for example. So it's very much making sure that you know the accuracy level of the information that you're receiving and that you're reporting on, but also how it's being given to you by your suppliers as well. Moving on to Scope 2. So again, what is it that Scope 2 emissions are made up of? So as I said before, Scope 2 are the indirect emissions. So effectively, it is any utility that you purchase. So you're talking electricity, heat, steam, anything that's not generated by an asset that is owned or controlled by yourselves. Again, what do you need to worry about? Again, it is the data. If you don't have the data, that's what you need to be worrying about, because you can't manage what you don't measure. Now, how to measure them? Indirect emissions are often slightly more straightforward to measure than direct emissions, as usually there is only one source. You have kilowatt hours for heat, for steam, depending on how you're invoiced, obviously, particularly for heat and steam. And again, it's making sure that that data is extractable from your systems, be it spreadsheet or accounting software, and making sure that you have access to that as and when you need it. How to manage your Scope 2 emissions? Again, it comes down to behaviour and the core operational aspects of the plant that you're working on. So within your business, for your scope 2 emissions, do you leave the lights on constantly in an area which maybe isn't occupied on a regular basis? Changing that will help you manage up your scope 2 emissions, as it will reduce that consumption and also reduce the emissions. So again, there's an awful lot to be said around behaviour and also programming of the plant that you're using on site to be able to manage those emissions for you. And again, how to understand the data. So as we said, the data for scope 2 emissions often is slightly more understandable than your scope 1 emissions, with the core element of it being in kilowatt hours, which I'm sure you're all very, very familiar with from your energy invoices. And so again, it's making sure that that data is being stored in an understandable format. Core key to everything is labeling, especially if everything is coming through in a spreadsheet, or that's how you track things within the business, and making sure that it's clear what you've collected and what you need to extract in order to be able to build your carbon footprint for your scope 2. So some things to consider. As you're here, I'm hoping you're all looking to set up a plan to be able to monitor and measure your carbon footprint. As the snap poll said, 25%, I think, have already measured your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions within the business, with 58% of you not. So, a proportion of you will have a plan, do have a plan, and that's brilliant, as that's really the first stepping stone to being able to get your carbon footprint up and running. A really important and underappreciated potentially requirement for making sure that your carbon footprint is really well put into place and you've got measures in place to reduce it, is the sort of details of energy efficiency actions that you're looking at doing, that you've already done, and making sure that you've got sort of a register of those to build on, to make sure that you've got your plan for reducing your carbon footprint moving forwards. And again, planning on how you're going to take control of that data and your reporting. Are you only going to collect, for example, cost data because that's what's most easily accessible to you? And is that the way that you're going to take control over the data and the reporting? So if you can answer these questions easily, then that's brilliant, and you're well on your way to getting your carbon footprint sorted for your business. But if maybe for some of these the answer is no, or you're not sure, then we've got some tips upcoming. So getting started on your carbon footprint. First off, core utility data. Once you've got that core data, so your gas, your electricity, monitored, either by reading your meters manually or automatically, and getting a feed of data for your other data. So that's your fuel cards, your mileage expenses, your invoices for LPG, for forklifts. That's your first hurdle down to getting that baseline nailed. The next step is really making sure that it's captured in a database, in a spreadsheet, but it's got to be what works for you. And once this is converted into carbon, yourself a baseline for your operation in terms of not only your energy usage, but also your carbon emissions. And from that baseline, you can then work towards getting those energy efficiency actions, set out a timeline put in place to get those up and running through the use of energy audits. then building on those energy audits, setting down, as Adam said, the implementation of those projects that have been identified to you, and that then bringing down your carbon footprint, and then the tracking and reporting that is really core in making sure that actually you can shout about all of those projects and hard work that you've done to implement your carbon reductions. And within that, you've got your carbon footprint. And I will hand you back to Adam now to sort of go through the sort of net zero toolkit side of things.
Thanks, Emma. So as Emma says, the toolkits, as we're describing them, is about trying to bring all of these elements together for you. So if you are actually, what you're trying to achieve with all of this is a carbon footprint. That's the end, almost the end goal, but that's the first thing. And that is identifying, at the moment, there are any real requirements, even within legislation at the moment, are to identify scopes 1 and 2 emissions, which I think, as somebody in the chat has commented, is not the most challenging part of identifying your carbon footprint, but it is the way that you get your own house in order, and how big you are will depend on how complicated that becomes. I think the second phase of that is then about identifying opportunities through site surveys. Now, we've called them energy audits at various points, site surveys, that called a number of things, but this is really opportunities that you as a business have identified to save, in most cases, to save some energy within the production process. And that can be feasibility studies about equipment changes, my old friend compressors, as I will often talk about, even then looking at the simplest things around behavioural changes. So as Emma said on a number of occasions, about looking at the way that you are programming plants or the use of the plant within the premises to be more effective. So, have you got legacy situations where people are turning kit on that doesn't need to be turned on as far in advance, because that's an old standing behavior that exists in plants? And Emma smiles there because she knows it's a very common thing that we see, and actually can have quite a small change with a very significant benefit, particularly in the SME space. When you've done that, you then have choice in the next phase. So in the next phase is project implementation. So you don't have to do any of this stuff. But if you're going to actually reduce your carbon footprint, and we're going to play your part in achieving the net zero goals of both UK manufacturing and the UK economy, full stop, is we're going to have to do something different. If we keep continuing as we are, then we're not going to achieve the goals that have been set for us and are now in our legislation. And then when you've done that, for me, this is where you get onto the other side of the coin, which is shout about it. So this is about the opportunity for you as businesses to promote the good work that you're doing around sustainability. And I know from the previous session and conversations I've had with various members, there's a lot of you out there that are very passionate about this net zero journey and have done some brilliant things and are great at shouting about it. I also know, conversely, there's a lot of people I've spoken to who have done some brilliant things and haven't told anyone. And actually, that's a shame, because there's a missed opportunity there to promote the good work that's already been done. So I think this is about creating a starting point, creating a baseline, and then moving yourself forward in a positive way, and making sure that you're telling both your customers and your suppliers and anyone else that listens what a great job you're doing about being net zero. And this is going to have impacts both for one business, lost business, recruitment. People are looking for businesses that have a strong identity around this kind of sustainability net zero journey. And we as a business have created this pack to work with Make UK to try and support you through however you need that support through the next, well, should we say 29 years, or is that a bit bold?
I think bold's good.
Thank you, Dawn. And
Good. Well, just to reiterate there again what you're talking about, obviously that net zero toolkit, it has been developed in partnership with energy and carbon carbon management, and it is a key component of Make UK's framework and is now available exclusively to Make UK members. It will provide a guide to manufacturing businesses, large or small, who wish to embark on or accelerate their path to net zero by 2050. I don't know if there's anything you want to add there, Adam, that I may have missed, but I guess now it's time to go over to the panel for the discussion with Adam, Emma and Brigitte. Stephen, I believe if you've got any questions in the chat, would you like to pose them? I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I had a few questions come through, and the first question is, why are we being encouraged to drive EVs, electric vehicles, if they contribute to scope 2 emissions?
Brigitte, you've got any answers for that one? You're on mute.
It's probably Adam who can answer, but I think the answer is that EVs are better than fossil fuel, conventional engine vehicles, so they will emit a lot less. Which the conventional engine vehicles would be anyway under scope 2. So compared to EVs, EVs are a lot better. Adam?
Yeah, Emma, you or me?
I'll go for it, why not? Yeah, so as Brigitte said, the emissions that are going to be come from driving electric vehicles are significantly lower than would be generated from driving your traditional sort of fossil fueled vehicles. You've also got sort of the decarbonisation of the electricity grid going on as well. And so within that further brings down the carbon emissions that would be generated from driving EVs as well. So it's very much the sort of pure carbon factor of the fuel that you're putting into the vehicle.
Stephen?
Thank you very much. So actually somebody did in the chat post a YouTube link that I think explains some of that as well. So that might be worth a look after the session. So the next question we had was, can ISO 14001 accreditation be used to meet scope 1 requirements? So that data's already been collected, can it be used to meet scope 1?
So with the 14001, that's more the environmental standard. So you would take into account your gas emissions, or your natural gas consumption. Certainly, it's whether within your 14001 certification that you choose to do the carbon conversion, because an awful lot of sort of the environmental element is, certainly in my experience, and that's sort of personal, is driven from sort of reducing your consumption, which does have a knock-on effect with your emissions. And the monitoring element of the 14001 standard would help you in terms of footprinting, but may not, again, take into account the scope 1 emissions, which you'd have from your company car fleet and that sort of things. It depends on the sort of structure of your 14001 standard.
Thank you. Hope that answers the question. And the next question has actually been answered quite comprehensively in the chat box, but I think it's worth raising now just in case anyone hasn't caught it or has any follow-up questions. So what size of companies does this legislation affect?
So yeah, so I'm just monitoring the chat at the same time, but I can see that the answers to the question are correct, that it's a turnover in excess of 36 million, balance sheet in excess of 18, and more than 250 employees, would mean that you have to qualify for the Streamlined Energy Carbon Reporting scheme, or SECA as it's often referred. Those are reasonably large undertakings as organisations, and that requires you to create an energy intensive metric and report on your carbon emissions as part of your obligations under the Companies House Act. Now, the reason that we're having a lot of this discussion today, and actually the SNAP poll sort of suggests this, is that there are a lot of organisations that actually don't get caught by that requirement. And actually what we're suggesting within the toolkit that we're promoting is that you're effectively doing a small version of SECA, so an appropriately sized response to your organisation. But as part of that, what SECA doesn't require you to do is actually identify those energy saving opportunities and then report on them. So effectively what we're doing is you're bringing those two schemes together. You're bringing two schemes together actually, which is streamlined energy and carbon reporting and something called the energy saving opportunities scheme, which also covers large business. Again, that's 44 million turnover and or 250 employees and a balance sheet of 36 million, I think it is. That's good. But phase 3 isn't due until 2023. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to take the parts of both of those schemes and apply those to your organisation, as I say, at an appropriate sort of scale. And that will deliver you the net zero position as a line in the sand. And then it's about an ongoing tracking and reporting against that level of performance. And I think that's the key with carbon footprinting is you can get a line in the sand. That's fine. Drawing a line in the sand is relatively straightforward. I think somebody in the chat has actually said scope 1 and scope 2's, I can't remember the phrase, but was straightforward or simple enough. And scope 3 is where the minefield really is. And I don't think I could probably put that better. Scope 3 is a whole other debate. And that's why we've devoted the entire session to just talking about emissions and the supply chain. But actually, just to get a simple, straightforward carbon footprint is actually, nominally speaking, quite straightforward. And that's what where you should start. But it's the principles of those schemes which actually are, I think, the right place to start.
And I think it goes back to what we said at the beginning about the commercial opportunity for businesses when other businesses are expecting to see that. So no matter how small you are in that supply chain somewhere, if you've got the green credentials, it is pushing your business a little bit further up that supply chain opportunity sort of relevance for some of the bigger organisations that have to do that. And if they can show that the people in their supply chains are doing that, that's a really good thing to do.
On a very simple basis, and this it's not entirely true because there's some stuff that sits between the gaps. But in principle, if everybody on this call looked after their own scope 1 and scope 2, everybody else on this call would automatically be able to respond to their scope 3 situation. And this is the reality of this of it at the moment. So we've got some OEMs on here, I'm sure, and some large manufacturers with whom a number of other people in here will be supplying information. At some point, they're going to ask for they're going to be doing their own scope 3 work. At which point they're going to be asking everybody else on this call for some information about your own scope 1 and 2 emissions. And the question, what we're trying to help everybody on this call with is the ability to be able to answer that question succinctly with a reasonably detailed report, and that's something that you can update on a regular basis or understand how to update on a regular basis. And I think that's the kind of the symbiotic thing that we've got going on here, that this isn't just one person's problem. This is all of our problem to deal with. And if we all deal with our marginal gains, then actually we've got a chance of reaching the end goal.
Good. Any more, Stephen?
Yeah, so we've had one that's just been answered by Dan in the chat. So you're off the hook there, Adam, I think. But one of the questions is, what do companies that don't reach either limit, so the limits where you have to start doing this reporting, what do they have to do legally?
In short, nothing.
Oh.
I
guess the other question is then, what should they be doing?
So broader question. So I think there's a couple of things in there. So I know Dan has answered the 50,001 question. I think is the one you're talking about ESOS. So if you have ISO 50,001, you don't have to. You have to comply with ESOS, but effectively it allows you to check a single box, which basically renders the process moot. The 50,001 is quite an undertaking, so not something to enter into lightly. I would probably add into that. In terms of the obligations, absolutely, there are no obligations legally for businesses under the thresholds that we talked about a moment ago to do any of this. I think what you have here is a discussion about, and this is something we would talk about on Streamlined Energy Carbon Reporting seminars, and ESOS the same, is actually to look beyond the obligation and actually to see these schemes as opportunity, to actually identify how you can use this carbon footprint, this green agenda, the green PR machine, whatever you want to view it as, to actually use that as a competitive advantage. And I'm going to use a line I've used many times on these seminars, but someone will lose a contract sooner or later as a consequence of their sustainability credentials, positively or negatively, depending on what mood you want to see that in. But it's either an opportunity to win, or there's a risk that needs to be dealt with here about the potential for losing contracts, because you can't meet the sustainability and renewable criteria and emissions criteria that you're higher up in your supply chain are going to be asking for. And I think that's the thing that we're trying to convey here, is that there are bottom line opportunities here by doing this. You know, there are fundamental cost savings to trying to achieve this net zero ambition. And it's just about it's possibly about seeing the coin from the other side.
Thanks, Adam. And Lucy Smith asks, how do you make sure that we're not double counting?
So I suppose that would depend in terms of what you're talking about, Lucy, in terms of double counting. If, for example, you're talking about potentially electric vehicles, for example, that you charge on site, and you monitor those, and you monitor the consumption that goes through your EV vehicle charging points. But if that's only a sub-meter of your central sort of electricity supply for your building, you need to make sure that actually you're not taking the whole building supply and adding the EV charging. So it's very much understanding what you're measuring and where you're measuring it at. If you're measuring it at sort of main meter level and the direct input, or if you're measuring it at a lot of little sort of sub-meter points within the portfolio.
Thanks, Emma. Now, the next question is from Tasha, and I must admit, I don't understand it, so I'm hoping Adam does, but Tasha might have to jump in here. So how is the data converted from kilowatt hours to TCO2E?
Tons of carbon dioxide emitted, I think.
Ah, brilliant. There we go. Over to you, Adam.
Emma?
So almost, Adam, it's tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So within a set of conversion factors is published by the government on an annual basis. And within that, it has hundreds of thousands of different fuel types and energy sources in a variety of formats. So you've got sort of diesel liters, diesel kilowatt hours, electricity kilowatt hours, gas kilowatt hours, everything you could imagine and more. And an equivalent conversion factor, not only for tons of carbon equivalent, but also for tons of carbon dioxide as a standalone greenhouse gas, also the methane as CH4, and the other greenhouse gases, which I can neither remember nor pronounce. But the tons of carbon dioxide equivalent is the sort of central one that adds together all those 6 sort of not carbon emissions, greenhouse gases. So it's all published by the government, and that's sort of the central resource for general carbon conversions.
Thank you, Emma. So actually, I'll do these next 2 questions in reverse order, because I think this might be an Emma question as well. If you buy green electricity, are you at net zero in that respect?
So it will depend on sort of your specific fuel mix. With carbon reporting, you have 2 approaches you can go down. You can go down what's called the location-based conversion approach, where you use those conversion factors that that we've just mentioned that are published by Bayes, which is sort of grid average, or you go down what's called the market-based approach, and you look at your specific fuel mix. So in this example, so your green electricity, you look at exactly how that's generated. So is it 100% solar? Is it 100% wind? Is it nuclear? And your supplier should be able to give you that. And within that, you'll have a very specific market conversion factor. And if that conversion factor is 0, then for those emissions factors, or for those suppliers rather, you would be at a 0 carbon emission. And that is a really good way actually to shout about what you are achieving in terms of carbon savings if you demonstrate that if you were using 100% brown electricity, your emissions would be this. However, because you've chosen to be on a green contract, you're 100% solar supplied, your scope 2 emissions are actually 0. It's a really good way to demonstrate that and shout about it.
Right, thank you, Emma. So Martin Johnson has asked, should we look at implementing ISO 5001 and or PAS 2050?
It depends. Without knowing a little bit more about what you do and sort of the specifics of what you're hoping to achieve, to answer that question kind of blindly. I think with 50,001 requires a complete cultural investment from your business in delivering against the objectives of 50,001. I think you have to be confident. In my experience, you have to be confident in your business's ability to actually deliver change and improvement in your process. It is quite a significant undertaking in terms of the reporting, the structure you have to create, and the general commitment over a prolonged period of time to deliver, or both setting it up and then delivering on it. So it's not a quick fix, and it has to be very much a cultural investment, I find, from an organisation. So anybody on the call that I think that it has continental owners or is part of groups and has 50,001 where it's perhaps been driven from the continent, where it's particularly big in Germany, then actually you will find that will come with a supporting pack of information, systems, reporting profiles that are able to actually help you deliver it. It's a very big undertaking to start that from scratch. I'd suggest, Martin, if that is something you're considering, then let's have a conversation kind of outside of this, and let's have to identify where that might be. But my advice is always, if 50,001 is, if you think that as a business you want to make continual improvement around how you're consuming energy and how your process works and how efficient it is, then 50,001 is a really great tool. If you're doing it for anything other than that reason, I would consider whether you're doing it for the right reasons.
Thank you, Adam. So Cyril in the chat makes a very good point. You're right about creating opportunities, but it could be a big constraint for small businesses. What would you recommend smaller businesses to start with, or any quick wins to focus on first?
Yeah, I think it's a very fair and very valid point. I saw that. I saw the question pop up. I think you start with low cost, no cost. So my advice remains, again, from the first session, which is start with doing the basics of energy efficiency. So first and foremost, try and work out how you can get your data more frequently. So either taking manual meter reads on a more frequent basis, so you understand when and how energy is being consumed on the most granular level you can find. So anyone that's got a half-hourly meter, half-hourly energy meter, as in it's read every 30 minutes, get that data from a portal, put it on a spreadsheet and analyze it. Try and overlay that with what process was happening at the time it was being used, and just look for stuff that doesn't look right. And typically try and understand what energy was being used on Christmas Day. And if you've got a lot of energy being consumed on Christmas Day, And unless you're really driving the business hard, the chances are it means that that's energy wastage. You've actually got a good window coming up many of you will, in about 10 days time. Easter Sunday, you get a similarly good read. Most businesses will be shut on Easter Sunday. Not all of them, but I know because of different process reasons. But, these are days where you shouldn't have any consumption relatively. So do that first. Try and identify where you're wasting energy. Then do the simple things. Make sure you're not, you've got automatic door closers. You've got variable speed drives where you can. You've looked at lighting. You just all the really simple things to make sure you're not wasting very small amounts of energy, because they will add up to something significant. Then look at the small process things you can do. Look at stuff that is relatively low to no cost about how and when you're consuming energy. Small behavioral changes or programming changes that might have an impact. Just think small. It doesn't always have to be leaping to the big ticket items, but think small and deal with those things first. And then actually, and this is a really clever trick really, is that try and identify how much money you've saved or are saving, and try and consider putting that into some kind of green fund. And actually, if you've done those basics for 2 years, how much money is that put back into the business? Could you take that X thousands of pounds and reinvest that into the business in some more significant items? You might call them a green fund. And then try and think of this as self-funding. A lot of you will have climate change agreements. The idea of a climate change agreement was it gave you some money back into the business as a discount in order to spend that money on making the business greener. Now, the reality of that is in most cases, that's gone into the business is now just seen as a way to get cheaper energy. So it's lost its way slightly, but the principle remains the same. I hope that answers your question, Sil.
Thanks, Adam. And so please do come in there if you want to add anything. Oh, yes, thanks, it says in the chat. The only other question we've had through on the chat is from Tim, who has shared a link about converting hours to TCO2E, and asking if the panel would recommend it. I suppose you'd have to go away and have a look at it before you can take a view on that.
Yeah, probably have to have a look at that, but we can send a comment around afterwards.
Sorry, carry on, Adam.
No, I was about to do your job. Sorry, Steve.
Yeah, and Guy Atkins from Joe Bird & Co.'s just asked a question. We're a small company. If we grow faster than we can reduce CO2 emissions per product manufactured, would this be deemed a success or failure? So relevant question for those high growth SME companies there.
So, in terms of your energy intensity metric, which is sort of what Guy's referencing there, the only reason that you'd be deeming it a failure is if sort of your business is growing, but you're not. So let me try that one again. Your business grows, but your manufacturing output stays the same, which you probably wouldn't expect from a business expanding, but it would likely mean that actually there's an element of inefficiency within the production, and it would probably highlight more, not necessarily failings, because that sounds really, really harsh, but sort of areas for improvement within the business operation, where you could then bring that carbon intensity of the operation back down to where you'd expect it to be on a normalized level.
So the principle of the energy intensive metric is it should allow the business to scale, and you'd be able to come back to that metric and actually say, regardless of, so if you put 10,000 extra units through, proportionately your power should go with it, and it will either go disproportionately with it or proportionately with it, or ideally what you'll actually be doing is you'll be able to put another unit on the top by using maybe 70% less carbon than you did for the previous one. And that's the kind of the objective, is that as you put more products on, you find more efficient ways of doing that, and actually you can drive, you're proportionately driving that energy metric down, not up. So I suppose energy metric going up, you could describe that as a failure in the carbon sense. I think you would probably take that offset as the improvement in the business performance, but that's a different debate for another day. Does that answer your question, Guy?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
So next question is, can we share some best practice for small tech startups? And I suppose anything that can translate across to any other sort of startup, small businesses as well.
I think the principles always hold, actually. You know, do the stuff that's free or low cost first. I think if you're as a startup, you've got an opportunity to do the right thing from the first day. It's much easier to get it right at the beginning than it is, frankly, for a number of the businesses that are on here at the moment. With, you know, decarbonising is a much bigger undertaking, you know, when it's about fundamental change in process in a lot of cases. So I think the basics always hold. I don't think, you know, the advice I'm giving now isn't necessarily manufacturing specific. It's actually about doing the right things all the time. So yes, I don't think there's any, I can't think of any specific advice I would have for a tech startup than I would do anybody else, which is do the basics well. Make sure you don't waste energy and waste carbon. You know, invest in low carbon transport wherever you can, electric cars, electric vans, electric lorries. Look for premises which are, you know, high efficiency buildings that have already got charging points built in, all the kind of stuff that you could do. Solar on the roof, you know, generate some energy. These are all choices you have as a startup that perhaps legacy businesses don't have. So I think that actually embed it, my advice would be embed it into your culture, and that will give you the greatest chance of success as you move forward.
And almost as if you planned it, Adam, that question about culture is the next question. So Kevin asks, to drive behaviour change, are there any posters available to download? I suppose you could turn that into a broader question about how do you get employees on board with this? Because it has to be a cultural shift, doesn't it? Not just a top-down process.
Yeah, I mean, you could probably do a session on its own, just on kind of cultural behavioural change within an organisation. I mean, how do you drive behavioural and cultural change? If I had a really simple, short answer to that, I'd be a much wealthier man than I am, I should imagine, because I think changing culture in any organisation takes time. So I think first and foremost, that's the thing here. This isn't likely to be an overnight success. I think where I've seen it done most successfully is that energy and carbon management, hence forgive the name dropped, but energy and carbon management in its kind of technical sense, as opposed to my company name, it's done best where it's just embedded into everything that is done. So actually it forms part of almost the appraisal process. About it's on flashboards throughout the premises that actually this is how much carbon we're consuming at this level, at this part of the business. Sub-metering your site so that you can actually then perhaps have production lines almost competing against each other to be more efficient. You know, it becomes, you just have to make it part of who you are as a business. If actually you're trying to change culture by just forcing a mandate through, it will just wither on the vine in the end, because actually you won't get buy-in. So I think that the ways is that you find a way of highlighting that data. So as I say, it's the best places I've ever seen it done have been everywhere has been sub-metered to within an inch of its life, and you've been able to show actually that machine there, that line, that shift potentially, you know, is more efficient than the other. All of these are things that you can do. I think you have to create champions within your workforce. So again, you know, it's not always about the boss forcing this down. It has to be the workforce themselves creating an engagement with what you're trying to do. So there are lots of posters that are available to download. I'm sure we can create something with Make UK if that would be a requirement. But there's millions of things out there about turning things off and turning things on. But I think actually, I come back to something I've said a few times, go back to your data. It doesn't matter if I'm here, I'm talking to the smallest energy user or the largest, data is the king here. It is absolutely the thing. And actually do things that are driven from that data. So if you can even if you can just identify that in the morning, someone comes in and turns every single factory light on at 5 o'clock in the morning when they walk in. And I'm afraid to say that could be the boss who just walks in and just puts everything on. Actually identify that that is what's happening and stop doing it. Try and just turn the lights on in the office that you're going to be working on, in the kitchen where you're making a cup of tea. Try and do the very simple things. And actually, if you just start with those simple things, then that will then just start running its way through the organization. And it's, we need to find more than the lights. We need to look at the process opportunities, but the lights is the thing which is easy to identify.
I think it's that behavior drives behavior, doesn't it? And I mean, it's going back. But what can I just jump in? Because what I'd like to do is see if we can get the second snap poll run. If we've got any more questions, can we maybe come back to that? Because I know 1 or 2 people are having to leave early, and it would be a shame to miss out on those actual polling questions before everybody starts drifting away into other things. But after that, before we conclude, if we've got a little bit of time, can we get the extra questions in there? Is that okay with you, Stephen? And if anyone's got anything, keep popping them in the chat. But if we could run that poll now, is that all right with you, Emily?
Yeah, we'll run that now.
Great. Let's jump onto that. Okay, the questions are there for you. If you could just... Okay, have we?
I think
A couple of people still voting. Just give it a moment.
Okay, we'll just get that one while people are still around. Just if everybody could just make sure they answer, that would be great, whether it's yes or no.
Okay, that looks like everyone is going to vote. So we'll end the polling and here are the results.
Great, that's looking good. Brigitte?
Yes, so really pleased that the session has been useful, and so we're expecting more. I can see there are more questions, so that's very good. And as to free consultation with energy and carbon management, that's fine. 40% of you are interested, which is good to hear. So we just hope that you continue to throughout our whole series to learn more.
Okay,
That's
great.
Yeah.
And if we can go
I'm
back.
very relieved that yes is the answer to the first question.
Yes.
Always a hold your breath moment. There's a couple of really good questions actually just in the chat that I think would be worth just picking off actually while we've got a couple of minutes. So Emma, it's one for you here. Sorry, Steve, I'm doing it for you. But
please do.
Employees own petrol when travelling to work by car. Where does that fit into the emissions gambit?
So that comes into scope 3. It's one of the scope 3 elements, which is the sort of employee commuting side of things, as it's not specifically a business activity. It's sort of one of the upstream or downstream activities. So it is reportable under the scope 3 side of things, if you want to include it.
I think there's a great comment in there about kind of promoting kind of the EV EVs to the employees through the kind of salary sacrifice. If there's an organisation you're able to do that, and that's fantastic. Just be mindful, if I might, about the requirements then to provide charging points on site, and obviously the knock-on effect that has. So it's absolutely, I think, the right thing to do. But I know in our own company, we've had this where we have employees that are moving on to EV, and we're now because we are always trying to do the right thing in terms of practicing what we preach. We're now rapidly installing enough EV charging points to deal with demand, or we were just before COVID stopped any form of travel. So it is very much kind of just cause and effect, and a little bit careful what you wish for, I suppose, to an extent, but absolutely the right thing to do.
Question there is from Nick, and actually it probably relates quite well to that tech startup question we had earlier. How do you measure cloud computing emissions? Is cloud computing?
So again, this would come back to Emma's point. So with the slightly different hat on I wear from time to time around data centers, data centers are able to provide fairly granular detail in terms of their own energy emissions, and are aware that they're a very significant contributor to emissions and to this whole net zero journey. So they've got their own problems and foibles to kind of to deal with, but effectively it's an upstream emission that you would have to account for under scope 3. But interestingly, that's a relatively knowing that sector reasonably well, that's a more straightforward answer to probably get from them, because they're so adept and used to answering it. In my experience, that may not be everybody's, but.
And yeah, that brings us to the end of the questions. So if anyone's got any burning questions they want to ask, please either put your hand up and unmute yourself, or pop them in the chat now. Oh, put your hand up.
I see one from Murray.
Yeah, Murray, unmute yourself, please, and we can hear you.
Press the space bar on your keyboard. There you go.
Is that it now?
Yeah, hold it down while you're speaking.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think one thing you need to take into account is the historical aspect of collecting data. If we go back to a year ago, it was quite common for us to go and travel to see our customers, for example, which we're not doing anymore because of COVID-19. So that has brought into measure, surely that has brought in quite a lot of changes, which we need to take account of. So, if we even go back 12, 18 months ago, we have customers all over the place. A regular one we go down to is Watford. We're now communicating with them by other means, by telecommunication. So surely that is a big step forward, and looking at it from a historical point of view in terms of the data is also important, is it not?
Emma,
yeah, no, absolutely. And for a lot of businesses, as you say, who have maybe already done a carbon footprinting exercise and are looking at doing sort of a second year, it's completely different. There's no comparables. The scope 1 emissions are so much lower, as you say, because you're not traveling anywhere.
Yeah.
And scope 3 emissions, if you're looking at sort of public transport travel, for example, are significantly lower for a lot of businesses. And it is the comparative aspect which a lot of businesses, particularly those that are qualifying for the SECR scheme, are struggling with at the moment, because they're either in their first or second year of reporting, and they're thinking, well, actually, our entire business operation has changed now. We do everything via Teams or teleconferencing. There's none of this jetting around the country. How are we going to make sure that this is demonstrated and that we've got some decent comparable data year on year? And I suppose a core element of that is the narrative that goes alongside it. So depending on where you're shouting about everything that you're doing and the carbon footprinting exercises that you are doing, it's making sure that you've got that appropriate commentary to say, well, actually, our scope 1 emissions dropped by 75%, but we stopped going anywhere. so it's not a genuine decrease, and making sure that it's quite clear that actually if COVID hadn't happened, that decrease may not have happened. And I suppose if it's a way that you're going to operate in the business moving forwards, you might not choose to use 2019 as your base year for your baseline of data, but you might choose to use 2020 because that was when that new operating standard sort of came into play, to make it comparable.
Yeah, but that's a change in culture, isn't it? That's what's affected, and that has happened, and we now find our clients are now preferring to work that way. So that's brought change, regardless of the motivation. Surely that's irrelevant.
Well, there's an element of it has happened and has changed the culture of business operations.
Yeah.
But would you have done it had it not been for COVID?
Yeah, but so what? You know, it's brought about change that we want, isn't it? We're not now traveling around. We're saving ourselves a lot of money, a lot of time, you know, expenses in hotels, etc., etc. So whatever the motivation is, and whatever the changes are in our society, that's brought about these changes. I don't see the relevance of that point. I don't know what you're trying to say is like there's some sort of worship that we have to go through, you know, some sort of ethos that, you know, if it's brought about the changes, then surely that is in effect what we are doing is achieving those objectives.
I think it's what are we talking about here? We're talking about actually the benefits that, if there can be some, that COVID has forced a cultural change on all of us,
Yeah.
and that we could be seeing an improvement in emissions. then yes, absolutely it has. Will we return to where we were historically? I very much doubt that. I think we will creep back in that direction in due course. I think the question was actually about how do you set baselines for comparison year on year. I think you've got some choice. I think what Emma's trying to say is you've got some choice on where you set that baseline. Do you set that against 2019 where we were traveling all over the place and show significant improvement in your carbon output? Or I think what Emma's saying is do you reset that baseline against what would be, in inverted commas, the new normal, and baseline yourself in all future years against that line? I think that's the question at hand here is where do you choose to set that baseline? Do you reset yourself based on this change in philosophy? I mean, we're just in this very chat, there are 100 people probably all saving 25,000 miles a year. Yeah, this very event possibly could have been a face-to-face event in days gone by. You know, it'd be an interesting event, calculations of how much carbon just this event has saved. But I think there are two parts to your question really, which is how do you set the baseline? You have choice, and that's going to be a business decision on where you decide to set that line and which one you want to work off. It's going to be challenging working against this year's baseline because I think you'll be showing an increase in carbon in future years, because I don't think we will I think we will return to some sort of travel to meetings. I've calculated that I will take out I think I worked out it was going to be 2/3 of the mileage I'll save, because I'll stop doing the first meetings, the first exploratory meetings. Those will probably still be online. So 2/3 of those don't turn into an opportunity for a meeting. The final third I will go and see, and we'll have a meaningful kind of workshop or a kind of real dialogue. So I'm going to save probably 30,000 miles a year, and I'll do the remaining 15 continue to do those. So I think that we'll have to see how that plays out over the next couple of years as kind of normality returns. And that's where this sort of the skill of Emma and her colleagues who do this all the time is that they'll be kind of providing commentary on how you set baseline, how you normalize. Perhaps we're going to have to normalize 19 and 20 data to work out what actually 2021 should look like and beyond.
Good. Is there any?
Answer the question, Miriam.
You happy with that answer, Marie?
Yeah, I'm just a bit puzzled by, at the end of the day, it's about change and about understanding that change and how you accommodate that and moving forward. I take Emma's point very much that it's moving forward from here and maintaining that type of practice. And certainly it seems to me that our clients certainly have an appetite for doing that. So the returning to the journeys all over the place, so for example, I see as something that's going to be a rare occasion.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, you just got to look at today. I mean, when we're putting these events together, we're looking continually, where do we go, where do we put them? And how do we get so many people in a room? And, this is amazing technology, obviously, and it's given us the ability, with doing our own actions and improving, we're getting there by doing this and getting so much more expertise in one place. You guys are leading it in your businesses, and to have you all there sharing ideas at these workshops it's a really brilliant thing to do. And it just wouldn't have happened. We might have had 30 people if we were in the Midlands. We might have had 100 people if we were down south. It just, we've got to look at what we can do going forward. And I completely agree with everything everyone's saying. It's fascinating to listen to.
Sure.
So
we have had some more questions in the chat if we've got time for those, Dawn.
We've got roughly 12 minutes. I just need to wrap up at the end. And that's why I wanted to get that poll out, because I know a few people are having to go different places, but happy for you to carry on.
So Gaia can see stuff on the poll. How would you measure CO2 for shipping overseas when we don't choose the shipping line or route that the goods are going by?
I think to tackle that in real detail, and please tune into episode 4. But Emma, fundamentally, this is a scope 3 emissions point again. So Emma, you might be a better placed to just answer quickly.
As you said, Adam, it is very much a scope 3 emission issue, and it does stem back to actually what you were saying earlier, Adam, about if everybody keeps a clean house, tidy house, whatever you want to call it, with regards to their own scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, getting that data for, as you said, sort of the shipping line or shipping route, will actually be easier, because the business, if they've got their scope 1 and their scope 2 emissions in order, would be able to give you that information direct.
I think it links interestingly to that last point as well, because if you took this year as a baseline for shipping, then it's a little bit all over the place in terms of how things are moving around the world because of various difficulties. So the data from this year will likely be an outlier. So it comes back to that point you made, Aaron, about baselines, I suppose. So, there's one question we've got to finish with from Cyril. Thank you, Cyril, for asking that. That's going to cheer Adam up when we ask that question. But James Cook asks, will ground air source heating and cooling be covered as a specific topic in a later event? Hard to access expertise on that. So do you have any guidance? Are we going to be covering that in future events?
I don't think so specifically, but I probably would prefer to try and take that one offline if I could, and perhaps respond afterwards. I don't have a great answer for it. It's not in the subject matter for this event directly, or not, at least not the technology's not, so it will come up as a subject, but not necessarily as a specific answer. We could perhaps squeeze it into the funding session next time, because I think there are some schemes out there to access funding. So if I could perhaps just take that one away and maybe just deal with that in the next session. Sorry, that's not a great answer, but there is a bit of a lack of tech out there, or people are capable of delivering the tech at the moment, certainly. So
I think Brigitte's going to come in with something. Brigitte, do you want to say something?
Yes, but not an answer, but just simply to say to everyone that if you see that there are things missing in the series of workshops, maybe, as this question, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat, and we'll see what we can do for future events or to integrate them in the existing ones. Definitely, we want to respond to your needs. And then, if I may, one last remark as well on about, you know, whether SMEs or smaller companies will be subject or not to legislation, or are. Well, clearly they're not. We've had the answer, but I would just like to say that it's almost an inevitability that the, you know, policy is going to roll out further. Schemes are going to be expanded to smaller companies, to a larger number of companies. So because the challenge is absolutely huge for the industry overall to decarbonize. So, you know, even if you're not obliged to do so, I think there is, you know, good reasons to do good, and also just to prepare for the future. Really, it's a challenge for everybody, for our planet and our people.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. And so I think I'm going to finish with Cyril's question, which is, where can we get the toolkit? Go on, over to you, Adam.
Yeah, so if anyone's got any questions about the toolkit, about how we can help, then if you answered yes to the poll question, then we'll be in touch with you directly. If you have changed your mind and you wanted to say yes but didn't at the time, if you either reach out directly to me, I think my email address is, our email address is on the email pack that will go out to everyone after the event. Feel free to drop me a line to that and we can have a chat. James, the question on the ground air source heating, I'll look into that for you, and perhaps if I could reach out to you after this and we have a quick conversation, then I will do that with your permission. And then we'll circulate the answer to that as part of some FAQs after the event, assuming I can do that within a reasonable time frame. But yeah, please reach out if you've got any questions. As I've said many times, you know, we are here as the partner to Make UK. You know, sometimes those conversations are simply us helping to provide some commentary, some advice. You know, that doesn't cost anything. So if you've got a question, please do reach out. Happy to kind of spend kind of half an hour running through some options. And if we can help, obviously, more commercially, then we will. If not, then you've got some information to go away and help you internally. So please use us as a resource. We are genuinely here to help.
Good, good. Thank you. Okay then, well, I do hope you've all found today's workshop beneficial. I'd really like to thank Adam and Emma from Energy and Carbon Management for their expertise, and obviously to Brigitte for tipping in there with various comments. But yeah, and thank you to all of you for taking time out of your day. I know how busy you all are, and for attending this and also participating in the discussion. Obviously, we wouldn't be able to have the discussions if you weren't throwing questions in. So that's been really good. I found it really interesting today. I hope you did. I'd just like to remind you also, the next workshop in this series is on Tuesday, the 27th of April, and that is entitled Where and How to Obtain Funding. And we will be joined by Catherine Barber, who is the Deputy Director of BEI's Energy Directorate. So that should be interesting. I will be sending out all of the information from today's event along with the recording. So you might have to wait a little while we get that recording put up live onto YouTube and everything else. There will be details of all the events, and as Adam said, we can make introductions. His contact details will be on there, and if you want to talk to myself or Stephen or Emily or anybody from Make UK with regards to what else we can do to help you if you're not a member and you've come on this today because of your interest, then we'd love to hear from you. But that's it from us. Unless anybody has anything else to say, I'm quite happy to end the session. I would say a couple of minutes early, so it's up to you guys.
No, very